Catholic Church has an official patron saint for almost anything you can think of. Dentists, firefighters, students. But underneath that top tier, there's a whole second layer of saints so obscure that most lifelong Catholics have never heard of their names. Patrons of jobs and problems so bizarrely specific that you'll wonder if someone in Rome was having a laugh. Today, we're counting down 6 of the most obscure patron saints in church history, starting with one you've brushed up against without realizing it, and ending with a saint so unknown that you may not hear their name again for a long time. Let's start with the name you've technically heard before, even if you didn't know it was attached to a person. Saint Vitus was a child martyr, born in Sicily to a pagan Roman senator named Hylas. According to his legend, Vitus secretly converted to Christianity as a boy alongside his tutors, Modestus and his nurse Crescentia, and refused to renounce his faith even when his own father tried to have him tortured into recanting, including, the story goes, locking him into a room with venomous snakes that refused to harm him. When threats and torture failed, all 3 were reported to the Roman authorities during the Emperor Diocletian's persecution of Christians and executed around the year 303 AD, reportedly surviving a cauldron of boiling oil and molten lead before finally dying. That kind of miraculous survival under torture was exactly the sort of story that got someone venerated as a martyr saint in the early church, and Vitus eventually became one of the 14 Holy Helpers, a group of saints in the Rhineland region who were each invoked against a specific set of ailments, especially during plague outbreaks. So why is he the patron saint over sleeping, dancers, and epilepsy? In parts of medieval Germany, people danced in front of the statues of Saint Vitus on his feast day for good health, and that tradition got tangled up with real neurological disorder, Sydenham's chorea, which causes involuntary jerking movements. Doctors started calling it Saint Vitus's dance, and the name stuck permanently to the disease, because that same chorea was, for centuries, lumped together with epileptic seizures as basically the same category of convulsive fit in pre-modern medicine. People started praying to Saint Vitus for relief from epilepsy too. The 2 conditions were never clearly separated in the popular imagination, and the oversleeping patronage is the simplest of all. People were genuinely afraid of sleeping through his feast day and missing it entirely. Moving one rung down the obscurity ladder, Saint Bibiana. Bibiana was a Roman martyr from the 4th century, and her legend is a genuinely brutal one, even by the early church standards. Her father, Flavian, was a Roman prefect who was branded on the forehead and exiled for practicing Christianity, later dying of his wounds. Her mother, Daphrosa, was beheaded soon after, and her sister, Demetria, reportedly dropped dead from sheer exhaustion and grief in front of Bibiana's eyes. Bibiana herself was placed in the custody of a woman named Rufina, who was ordered to corrupt her into abandoning her faith. And when that failed, Bibiana was tied to a pillar and scourged to death with weighted leather whips. Most of this survives only through legend rather than historical record, but it was enough to get her formally venerated. And a church, Santa Bibiana, still stands in Rome today, built directly over her supposed burial site. And that burial site is exactly why she's a patron saint of hangovers and headaches. Legend says a specific herb grew from the soil where she was buried, one believed to cure headaches and even epilepsy. Somewhere along the way, cures headaches widened into cures the specific kind of headaches you get after a rough night. And Bibiana quietly became the saint you pray to on Sunday morning when you deeply regret Saturday night. Here's one you probably heard the name of, just not for religious reasons. Saint Corona is a legendary martyr, likely from the 2nd or 3rd century, said to have been just 16 years old at the time of her death. According to the story, she witnessed a Roman soldier named Victor being tortured for his Christian faith and stepped forward to comfort and encourage him. An act of open sympathy for a condemned Christian that got her arrested on the spot. Her legend says she was executed by being torn apart between 2 bent palm trees, a gruesome and symbolic death that echoed how the early church liked to describe the suffering of its martyrs. Centuries later, her relics were reportedly moved to Aachen, Germany, by Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, tying her to the imperial court and giving her cult a second life in medieval Europe. For most of those 17 centuries, almost nobody outside a few corners of Europe knew her name. Then 2020 happened, and Saint Corona started trending purely because of the coincidental overlap with the word coronavirus. What almost nobody realized during all those headlines is that she genuinely is the patron saint of epidemics. but also, oddly, of treasure hunters and gamblers. Some of that comes down to her name itself, Corona, Latin for crown, and treasure hunters and miners looking for gold and buried coin figured a saint whose very name meant crown was worth invoking. She went from total obscurity to a global punchline without most people learning a single true thing about her. Now we're getting into names that genuinely stump most people. Saint Drogo was born in 1105 Flanders, and his mother died giving birth to him. A fact that, according to his legend, haunted him his entire life, since he came to believe he was personally responsible for her death. He gave away his inheritance, worked for a time as a shepherd, and then spent years as a relentless pilgrim, reportedly walking to Rome and to Santiago de Compostela in Spain 9 separate times. Eventually, he developed a severe, disfiguring illness, possibly a hernia or a form of elephantitis, that left him so visibly changed that he asked a local priest to wall him into a small cell attached to the village church, with only a narrow window through which he could receive communion and watch Mass. He lived there as a hermit for the rest of his life, until his death in 1189, and was venerated locally as a saint almost immediately for the extremity of his penance and devotion. He's the patron saint of unattractive people for the obvious reason. He asked to be permanently hidden from view because of how he looked. His second, much stranger patronage, coffee house keepers, comes from a separate legend that he could billocate, appearing to tend sheep out in the fields while townspeople swore they saw him in there, even though witnesses confirmed his body would never left his walled-off cell in prayer. Somehow, a man who could apparently be in two places at once eventually became the patron of people running your local cafe. A connection almost nobody can fully explain, which might be the most fitting thing about him. This next one I guarantee you've encountered, you just never knew. Clodald was born in 522 AD, a Merovingian prince and grandson of Clovis I, the first king to unite the Franks. When his father Clodomir died in battle in 524, his uncles Childebert I and Clothar I saw his 3 young sons as threats to their own claims on the throne, and according to the horrifying legend, personally killed 2 of Clodald's brothers with their own hands to eliminate them as rivals. Clodald escaped with the help of loyal nobles and fled to Provence, and rather than attempt to reclaim his father's throne or seek revenge on his uncles, he cut off his own hair, a deliberate symbolic renunciation of royal status and Frankish culture, and entered religious life instead, eventually founding a monastery and living as a monk until his death in 560. So why is this Merovingian prince the patron saint of nail makers? It's almost entirely a language accident. His name, Latinized and passed down through French, became Cloud, which sounds nearly identical to the French word clou, meaning nail. That's it. That's the whole connection. And here's the twist. You already know his name, whether you realize it or not. St. Cloud, the well-known Parisian suburb, St. Cloud, Minnesota, both places are directly named after this man, a prince who gave up a throne to live in a quiet devotion. And centuries later, most people only recognize his name because of a pun about hardware. And now, our final saint. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to tell you everything about this saint except the name. Try to guess before I say it. This saint was born into royalty in 7th century England, the daughter of a king and queen, and was raised in part by an aunt who had already given up her royal life to become a nun herself, a path that clearly left an impression. Despite reportedly turning down multiple marriage proposals meant to cement political alliances for her father's kingdom, this saint chose the church instead, eventually becoming an abbess who founded and oversaw several monasteries across central England. The saint died around the year 700 and was venerated as a saint almost immediately after. Over the following centuries, as Viking raids repeatedly threatened the region, this saint's relics were moved from resting place to resting place for safekeeping before finally setting in the city of Chester, where an entire cathedral, Chester Cathedral, was eventually built around what was once this saint's shrine and still carries this saint's name in its full dedication today. And here's the patronage that makes this saint so unforgettable. According to legend, a flock of wild geese kept invading monastery land and destroying the crops. So this saint personally confronted the geese, scolded them directly, and commanded them to leave and never return. And according to the story, they obeyed, permanently. So, a 7th century English princess turned abbess, buried in Chester, patron saint of protection from wild geese. Have you guessed it? This is Saint Werber. Now here's my actual question for you. I want you to be honest in the comments. Had you ever in your life heard that name before? More importantly, have you ever, even once, prayed to the saint for protection from geese? Because if there's ever been more painfully specific, more genuinely niche, more perfectly obscure patronage in the entire Catholic Church, I have not found it. Saint Werber, patron saint of a problem I didn't even know needed a patron saint. So there you have it. 6 real, genuinely venerated saints counted down from you've technically heard of this guy to a princess who yelled at some geese and it worked. If one of these surprised you more than the others, tell me which one in the comments. And if you've got an obscure patron saint on your own that you think could dethrone Saint Werber, I want to hear it. Thanks for watching. God bless.